Hey guys. Sorry. I always start every tutorial with that because I think it's so funny. It's probably not that funny anymore,
Are you
but
recording, man?
yeah, I am. Every time, that's why I was waiting for just the right moment. Everything on YouTube now, you go to the tutorial, it's always like, "Hey guys, like who are you talking to? Who are you talking to?" Okay, so let's start with file setup. A few little tips around file setup. Have you guys have started to work with Bleed, I assume, and things like that? I know most people usually have a handle on that, but I'll just go through it really quick just in case people are missing something here. So the details of the file setup are shown here. In this case, the width and height that you want to set are the final trimmed dimensions of your document, whatever that actually is. InDesign allows you to do a lot of different units, and you'll notice in InDesign's preferences that it'll actually allow you to do a different set of units for horizontal versus vertical measures, and that's because typically in page layout in desktop publishing, vertically we're dealing with points and picas, like with reference to the height of text lines, like your grid is set out by your text size, whereas the width of the page doesn't have anything to do with text height and line spacing. So often you'll have inches, for example, for the horizontal, and points or picas for the vertical dimension in InDesign. For us, we can just keep it nice and clean at inches. The margins you can change after for your page, but I'm just going to set this to be just one page for now. There's no need for it to be facing. The margins, it just gives you a guide for how far in from the edge of the board you're working on. And then bleed and slug. So typically we like to do sort of industry standard is 1/8 of an inch, so 0.125 is a bleed dimension. So I'm going to just draw really quickly on the board. This won't be on the recording, obviously. But if we have our final trim size of a board, we set our bleed, I'm going to exaggerate it. So our bleed marks go like this, for example. So then when we go to put content onto that board, if we want our content to run off the edge of the board, we actually need content that's going to get trimmed away. So if we set an object like that, so there's our frame. I'll stand on this side so you guys can see that, right? We're running that right to the bleed line. When we export this PDF, what it's going to do is it's actually going to create a document that is this big as a PDF, and that document's going to have crop marks on it that look like this. This way, the space, so the printer's going to print this blue outline for here, because the printer needs a little bit of margin to run the paper through. So the printers, very few printers can actually print right directly to the edge of the paper. So because of that, the printer is going to print all of your content to the red line, just as you had it laid out. And then you're going to go through and cut on those trim lines and make sure that everything is nice and clean. So that's what we're doing right now by setting the bleed level, is we're setting this dimension right here. Bleed. You might have in some production setups where you need a larger bleed than that. So for example, say you're doing a large sign or something where you're printing onto physical stock like coroplast or something like that, they might ask for more. And that just has to do with the margin of error in the printer and the margin of error in the cutting. If our printing was perfect and our cutting was perfect, we wouldn't have to put any material past because we knew when we trimmed it, it would be right at the edge of our print. But because there's always a little bit of give and take, you guys know from your printer work, right, that things come out a little bit staggered, a little bit off. This kind of cleans everything up. So we get our bleed set up like that, and we end up with a drawing that looks like this, a document that looks like this. So the black is the outline of your page, here's the line of your margins, and red is the line of your bleed. So if you have an object in a frame that you want to run off of the edge of the document, whether that's a photo, a background tone, anything else, a rendering, that has to run right to the red line. Okay? This is familiar to you guys? This is good? Good to go over again? Yeah? Okay. So when we talk about full bleed in documents, it means that our stuff is extended past that. We're actually printing onto a page size that's larger than our final trimmed print size, and then we're trimming down to that print size. So that's some file setup stuff. if we do a little bit of typography work here, I'm just going to show you some tricks. So if we have a text box here, there we go. So let's fill this with placeholder text. InDesign is really friendly for that. And we can see that what we have is based on, if we look on our paragraph style, there's a thing called basic paragraph, okay? And that's an undeletable paragraph style. Do you guys work with paragraph styles in InDesign? You should be. Okay, good. If you're not, figure out how to do it. I think there's a tutorial I did last term, like for the essay, is actually posted, and it goes through some more detail about exactly how to set that up. I'll show you a little brief demo here. So for example, if this is our title, so actually when we're building paragraph styles, it's best to go from your most common style to the most exceptional style. I don't mean exceptional as in having the most exceptions. It'll be exceptional. I'm sure you guys will do exceptional work. But if we want to change our basic paragraph, what we can do here, since Branko doesn't like serifs, we'll just change this to something like.
Okay for the body text.
Oh shoot. Okay. All right.
That's a kind of standard. No, this is kind of
No, I'm just
one of the kind of formulaic things from the typography and graphic design is that you would want sans serif typeface for the title, and you can then use a serif font for the body text, because serif fonts are easier to read. That's why they exist. So this is why you would often find, say, Times Roman being used for the body text and, say, Helvetica or Arial for the title.
Okay, so let's do that then. So we'll use a font here called Kaluna, which is a very beautiful font, and we will then go in here and we'll redefine our basic paragraph style to be that. So now everything is based off of that style. You can see if we look at this overall, it's a little bit long each line, right? We have the same problem that we looked at on some boards. There's too many words per line, and we can just use this placeholder text to get a good sense of that. So in InDesign, let me just use the space that we were given to increase the number of columns. And that's a setting that's not a paragraph style, that's a setting of a text box. Okay, number of columns is a property of text boxes that can be overridden in certain places by text styles, but generally speaking, we want to keep that. That's a property of the text box, like so. So say we'll do a heading and we'll do a main title. So do anyone have a good title for this? What should we call this?
Amazing title.
Amazing title.
And the sans serif font, please.
Yes, sir.
A bigger typeface.
I was thinking of going bigger. Yeah, I was thinking of going bigger. When you're working with document baselines, there's a whole kind of set of decisions you can make around having all of your type sizes fit within multiples of a baseline common denominator, kind of common factor. We're not going to deal with that right now. So let's go really big so that we can learn some other things. Whoops. Whoa, right. Okay, so that looks terrible. Want our leading. So the leading is the amount of space between two lines of text, and the tracking is the space between letters. People talk about kerning sometimes. Kerning is about particular pairs of letters and how much space gets put between them. So fonts aren't spaced equivalently. So the leading here we'll just set to auto in this case, and then let's do this Nimbus Sans. Let's make it a big bold Nimbus Sans, and then let's change the tracking and just crush that in on itself a little bit just to be really mod. Okay, and I'm going to actually back this down a little bit just to be finicky. Great, so we have an amazing title. That looks great. So we're going to go to our paragraph styles. We're going to make a new paragraph style, and we're going to rename this title. Okay, we're not going to base it on anything. And now we have our basic paragraph and we have our amazing title. So notice that there's a few things that we don't really like right now still about this, like the text is hugging the bottom of that title a little bit much. So if we were doing this properly, what we would do is go into our title, indents and spacing style options, and we add space after. We check the little preview box in the bottom of the dialog here, because we always want the space between the title and the text. A perfectly clean set of typography in InDesign has no extra carriage returns. You guys have done this before where you are trying to space things out. It's just like when you're making a title page in Word for a paper or something, you like write your title and you like enter, you know, just like return, you know, and then you like put the date and then you like push and then all of a sudden your date pops from the page below. It's just a total nightmare. We want to control all of those things in InDesign with paragraph styles. Okay, so we'll make a nice amount of space after. Actually, let's do a bunch like that. We'll make it a nice even 1.25 inches. Great. And what I'm going to also do is something called, whoops. Very amazing title, because then we can do some other things with this. So this is looking okay right now. That might be good enough for some people, but we will not stop here. So there's a few things we can do. So sometimes when your title, you don't want, say you want your title to run full span across the columns. You guys have probably done this before. You're like, I don't want the title to be there. So you put your thing in, and then you start hitting enter. If you ever catch yourself hitting enter like repeatedly in InDesign, stop. You're making a mistake. Return to your origin. Okay. What we want to do here is we're going to play with this through paragraph styles again. We're going to edit the title, and we're going to look at span columns. Span columns. We want to span all the columns. Look what it did for us, right? You can see them behind. So when it's a single column, span columns. And you can choose how many. We just say all. If you had a set of 5 columns and you wanted to just span the first 2, you can set that to 2. But here we're going to span all the columns, and we have something there. So it's automatically going to line up our body text below that for us. Beautiful, right? That's working very well. But it's a little bit unsatisfying still because we have this little word here off to the side. So again, what you might have done back in your high school paper days is gone up to here and put a carriage return in, right? To balance the title out so it looks visually, so we don't have a word hanging on the end there. That's also a huge pain because what happens is, and everyone will recognize this, I think we put the carriage return in, and then as things get wider and shorter, all of a sudden things stop making sense. What we can do in InDesign within our paragraph style for this title, again, I'm double-clicking on title. This brings us into our character settings here. What we can do, it's under indents and spacing. There's a checkbox called balance ragged lines. That takes all the lines in that paragraph and it makes them as even as it can. So I turn that on. Oh, we also want to turn off our hyphenation. There we go. Okay. So if I were to demo this by adding some words, so you can see it pushes it down right with the next line. Then all of a sudden it's equal enough to be 2 lines. And now we're at 3 lines, it's going to pull it out. So it's always balancing. It's always balancing those lines so they look visually strong. Okay. A few other little tricks. You guys have probably done the thing in InDesign or Illustrator, or heaven forbid Photoshop. I've seen boards laid out in Photoshop. It just keeps me awake at night. You like a paragraph rule like this. Oh yeah, all of a sudden we're like, you know, reading The Economist. But in a good way. I mean that in a really good way. I'm sorry, right? And then you have a couple of these on your thing, and invariably this one's like that, and you can see it from a mile away, and it's upsetting. So what we do is, again, we manage that through paragraph style. So we hop into the title, we go into our title here. There's a thing called paragraph rules, which is not rules as in like how the paragraph should behave. It's rules as in things drawn with a ruler. So we can turn a rule on above. You can see we can offset, so we can line that up exactly where we want it to be. We can change the weight of that line. We can change the color. We can have it always match the text. We can have it match either the width of the column. In this case, because that paragraph style is spanning columns, it's going to span all the way. Or we can have it run the length of the top line of text. Just like so. Okay. You can move it in different ways, so you can indent it this way. Like these are all they're all relative controls, right? So that if we, for example, introduced another title here. Great, so you can see it formatted it for us with the same things. This also shows us that our title has a bit of an issue, right? That it's running over some things. So if we go into title, we want to make sure under our indents and spacing that we have enough space before set aside. Ulante dundi dulaptare sida. That's what I always say. Sorry, I'm in a weird mood this morning. I'm sorry. All right. So that's a little bit of really basic text frame stuff. You can obviously, like, we could continue this if these were subheadings. Here we could make a new paragraph style. We'll call this a subjetting. Subheading, we can go right away in here and we can change some of this stuff. So we can go right here and do, what we're using, a nimbus, bold, because we don't want to use too many typefaces. We can actually see right in behind how this is looking as I tweak this stuff. Here we probably just want to kick a little bit of space before that guy, something like that. We want to leave it within just like that. Maybe we want to balance ragged lines in those as well, just so we don't get a weird thing. Like so, okay? So now if any other place in our board has a subheading, we can just activate it by clicking once. All of the spacing happens, all the formatting happens directly, and all of those headings are then live linked right to the paragraph style. So if I go back into title here and I change for title this down to, because I think maybe we think it's too big, change this to 60 and this to 70, we can just see it happen in the whole document right away. Okay, so it's like you're working parametrically in a sense with the material in the document.
Then are you going to fix the body text? It's actually hurting my eyes. Like when you go between paragraphs, there should be a blank line between them, or extra space. Or
oh yeah, sure.
Indent the first line.
No, that's a good point. So under basic paragraph, in the olden days, we would do first line indents like this, right, to indicate first, because we didn't have as much control over the distance between the lines, right, because we were working with actual typesetting plates, right, so you had your leading spacing was already set, right, so you either did a full space, which was too much, or you did an indent. We actually don't need to do this anymore, so it's fallen out of style a little bit. What we can do is just a little bit of space after, like that, right? Not quite a line, something like that, just to really make sure that everything feels right. We don't want to do any balancing of this here. And if in the case where, say, you're doing a bibliography, this won't apply to your boards here. What you do is you push everything over a little bit, and then you pull the first line back. You can see what's happening there.
It's a negative indent.
That's right. Like that, and I usually advise against hyphenation. What I see often in board design is people really like, whoops, I didn't quite pull that back, did I? What I see in board design is that people really are fond of, I'll just make this all basic. So basic. Of this
Justified?
double justified. This can work, but it mostly doesn't work. Like most examples of it don't work very well. You see what it like looks great, right? You're like, oh, it's like rectangles. I remember those, and all of a sudden it's familiar and great again. But when you try and actually read this, other than the fact that it's in Latin and it's actual nonsense, the space between the words changes, right? This is how they make up the difference to make sure that this line is nice and straight. I find it, unless you have enough words per line, I find it really distracting. This almost works because we have a very small font and actually a good number of words per line. We're sort of on the upper limit. But you'll see what happens as we narrow this down, that becomes more and more pronounced because it has less gaps to work with, right? Because now he only has 2 spaces to make up that distance in these lines, right? So, and the whole kind of block starts to break down. So if you're going to use this full justification, which, you know, it's a free country, then I would suggest, see, isn't that nice how the title is automatically making itself all even for us? I would suggest for legibility, for me, that this is much nicer to read, and that these edges are still implied. You still get a bit of a datum there. You just have to become comfortable with it. I think it's just a thing with design. We often treat text on pages like an object, like no one's actually going to read it, like we just had to put it there, or we put it there for aesthetic effect. But I'm actually interested in what you guys have to say. So the other thing that we use text for on boards is labeling, right? So we'll have a frame of some kind. I'll put my favorite tutorial image. Because it's sort of the question everyone's asking when I'm doing tutorials. So we've got our wonderful guy here, and we want, so this is what happens, right? You're like, I need to label this. This is the label for my image. And then you do this. And then you keep working on your board. I see this so much. And then, right, it's the same thing as the lines. You end up with I'm going to make it even more subtle. That and that. You know, even if these images are lined up, kind of, these labels aren't working, right? So we fix that by going into text frame options. Text frame options, Command or Control B, should be a tool you use a lot when you're in InDesign. You can see here we can right away choose where our text is anchored to the top, center, bottom of the text box. So if I switch this to bottom, if I turn preview on, you can see now our text builds itself up from the bottom of the box. It's sort of like cell alignment in Excel, right? You like, is your text anchored to the top or anchored to the bottom? In this case, we want to anchor to the top still. But what we'd like to do is play with this inset spacing. I'm going to unlock these because we don't want them to all move together. But if I pop a little bit of inset spacing on this text box, so these are options for the text frame, right? We're not playing with paragraph styles at all here. We can actually push the contents of that off of the sides of the thing. So if I turn the left one on, you can see it basically working like a margin in web design. If you guys have ever done web design, right? We're pushing things off of the edges. So this inset spacing, we can set to whatever we might want. We say top. In this case, I might actually want this anchored to the right. So now, with a wonderful snaps, this snaps to the image, to the corner. I let go of it, and that is always going to be in exactly the right position. Okay, no matter where. So really can easily, we just delete that, and I copy this up to here, and then we just snaps right into place. So with that kind of approach, then we're always dealing with consistent labeling for things, right? So, and this is often on graphic boards, and you're laying them out, the final pieces in InDesign. You have labels for drawings, you have labels for all sorts of things. If you use this approach with text frame options, then life gets much easier. Let me just pull that up again, make sure. So in text frames options, you can balance the columns. So just like we were balancing the lines this way, you can balance columns so that they appear even at the end. Sometimes you have like one full column and then two lines. So a text frame will actually pull things even. You can change things with baseline. Here you set the number of columns, all of that kind of thing. This is another important little toggle that's hard to find if you don't know where it is. For example, if you have text wrap turned on for this image, okay, so we're asking it to, I'm just going to make it smaller for this demo. Where'd he go? There he is. So we're doing text wrap, right? So it's pushing this text out of our way. Once people start playing with this, they're like, they never go back to laying out a document in Word ever again. You can see, so we have this kind of thing, great. So say for whatever reason you thought that was a good idea, and you want to place now your label here. It's pushing it out of the way, right? Worst case scenario, it makes it disappear altogether. Text frame options for your label, ignore text wrap, and everything's fine. Okay. That's a small thing, but it can be really frustrating if you can't track it down where that's coming from. Let's see. Balance regular lines, paragraph rules. Okay, it's time for the big show, which I don't know if you guys know this trick. You have a rectangle frame tool. You're drawing a rectangle. While you're holding and dragging this rectangle, use the arrow keys on a keyboard to make a grid of squares. Literally, there's always an audible gasp. If you hold down Shift, you can strain to squares, the square shape. And then if we add, you can see we're always working with squares. So that's just using the arrow keys. You guys have grids of things to place. You literally have a very specific grid of things to place if you're doing it this way. This will save you endless headaches. And then we're ready to go. We have, I'll go back here, we're ready to go. If, for example, in an array of these that you would like one image to span a bunch of them, but you want it to participate in the grid, you can select those objects and you can make them a compound path. Okay, object paths, compound path. So now you can see what happened to the X in behind. If we use our little content picker upper, putter downer, he now inhabits all of those squares together without us having to do anything special with that. So that's quite a nice way to deal with grids in that way. The question you're probably asking is, how do I set the spacing between frames when I do that? Yeah, head's nodding. If you go up here to Layout, Margins and Columns, you can see this gutter value. That's like the value, the sort of default value for the space between your columns. If you set that to a different number, that becomes the gutter that's used in when the frames are placed. So if we want a big half-inch gap between frames, you can see that it allows us to do that. If we want absolutely no gap between frames, we can turn the gutter to 0. And then as we create the frames, just like that. Okay, so that should save you a little bit of time and headache. You can do the same kind of ton of time. Sorry, heaps and heaps of time. You will have a weekend to yourself again. Yeah. Okay. All right. So there's that decision. Sometimes what I like to do when I'm laying things out is I'll actually give these. I'll put the containers in and I'll give them a tone, but not black. I'll usually do a light, like a 25% gray or something like that, because when we're reviewing the board, it has a sort of presence without any. It's better than doing an outline on it. It simulates an image a little bit better. It's best to actually put whatever content you have in there, though. That'll always things always simulate themselves the best. Grid of containers. Okay, so we're going to talk about directional feather, which is the effect that we were talking about. So say, okay, we're just going to go with it. I'm just going to move this up a bit. So say we want a big dramatic rendering of a strange medieval man anchoring the bottom half of our board. Okay, so we're going to create a big frame here. You notice that I'm pulling that frame right to the extents of the bleed, right? So that because we have the image in this case going right off the bottom. I'm going to pick this guy up with the content collector, dump him in here just because he's handy. And then there we go. So using our direct selection tool, we can adjust where he sits. Oh, look at that alignment with the bottom margin. Okay, great. So this is a little awkward for so many reasons. One of the things we can do in InDesign is apply an effect. It's called a directional feather. Okay, so the directional feather allows us to control feathering of that image in terms of its transparency in any of the 4 directions or combination thereof. In this case, we want to leave these unlocked from each other, and we just want to put, I'm just going to put a 3-inch feather. Just turn on preview. You can see, so right away, we've applied the feather to this image, and it's starting to fade away. You might find that you need to have this be broader than you think, like 5 inches, depending on what you're doing. I'm going to actually put a tone behind here so we can see what's happening with that. Choke, basically, within the container that the image is in, squeezes your gradient. You can see it quite obviously there. If the choke is at 100%, we have a straight line again, and 0 choke means that we are running that gradient to the longest extent that it has. If you're getting strange things with a placed Illustrator file, it might be because it's detecting various edges. So we can say first edge only. In this case, the leading edge and the first edge are the same, so it doesn't have any apparent difference. If we were to, okay, let's just say okay for this. Let's put a tone in the background of the entire board, just so we can see what's happening. I always try and do, you know, the nicest stuff during tutorials, so you guys know exactly what you should be doing with color and text and images.
Yeah, I was wondering what you're going to do.
Straight mustard. Straight mustard. I'm just going to place this on a separate layer. Drag it to the back, so we're not selecting it and messing about with it. And
how many of you use layers before in InDesign? Okay, quite a few.
Great. I want it to be much lighter, since color is sort of one of the 7 deadly sins today.
It's
Great.
the sin.
It's sorry, the sin. There's not 7. There's just one sin, and it's color. So you could see that we pick up, you know, whatever tone we can. So one thing you might find, if you have any choke at all, or if the kind of PDF flattener isn't working very well, or you have kind of a cheap PDF, is that you end up with a line that you can perceive where the image actually ends in the gradient. It's very ugly and very distracting. So sometimes what we'll do is actually extend the container further up for that thing, right? So the object still sits within here and the container moves past. That can be one useful way to do that, because just when the PDF flattens its transparencies, it reads it as a full container rather than reading it as the edge of a container. That's a small thing. If we were to, say, have this guy in the corner, say we had a strip here and we wanted this to bleed in both directions, we go back up and look at our directional feather, and we can adjust our directional feather, on the right, like this, or we can change the angle of the feather. You can actually see quite dynamically how that rocks back and forth. So if we wanted on the angle, we can, I mean, obviously once we get into this territory, we need much broader consideration for things. Yes. Right, so you can tweak the angle of that thing, allow it to bleed in different directions. You can also, if you need more specificity in the way that that's bleeding off or fading off, do it in Photoshop. So on the Photoshop end of this image, I would create a mask that's fading off to the edge and then place that in here. So both ways work. But if feather in InDesign can be a handy way, especially for this example here, because you're not dealing with that. You can play with that gradient and play with how it's sitting with other things rather than guessing in Photoshop and moving back and forth.
So masks will be demoed on Wednesday in Photoshop.
Yeah, you guys have done a little bit of that sort of thing. So have you guys ever used the pre-flight panel? This is a thing in InDesign. This helps us figure out if everything's good to go before we make things. So when pre-flight is on, it's set to basic working. If you do anything else, make sure you turn it off while you're working, because it checks every time you save or make a change to the document. So here it's just telling me that there's overset text, and we can click and it takes us right to the issue to show, hey, look, you've got text that's overset on this text box, and so then we can fix that, right? We can drag this down and fix that, and you can see the error goes away right away in our pre-flight panel. You can check for other things, like you can define a profile. So you can say, for example, we want particular colors, or for images and objects, you can say set a minimum image resolution. So you can say, give me an alert if my image resolution is too low for some printing level, and that resolution will actually be based on the size of the object on the print page. So you can also see that I'm just going to pull this back down. So if we click on this fella here, when we look at the links panel, Where's my information? It always changes the screen size a little bit when we connect to the projector. So under links, when you click on a link, you can see this particular version of this guy. Oh, it's going to not cooperate. You can see there's a value called effective PPI. That shows you how many actual dots per inch you have on that page for that image at that size. So the effective PPI for this guy right now is 204. We want to get to an absolute minimum of about 260 and ideally 300 PPI in terms of effective placement. You'll see this exact same image, the same resource. If I click on this big one, the effective PPI is dropped down to 75 because he's so much bigger on the page. So it's saying, well, I actually only have 75 bits of information for each inch of actual print space. Very handy tool to help you make sure that everything is in good shape before you go to print.
If you just jump in.
Yeah.
The reason that Matt suggested you use 300 is that most of the printers that are in use nowadays, would have 1200 dots per inch resolution, and you would want to have a ratio of 1 to 4 between the image resolution and the print resolution. So it's like for 1200 you go 300 ppi. For a 600 dpi printer, you would go 150 ppi, and so on. And in the day, we used to have low resolution printers. Like if you're having 300 dots per inch, then you can go as low as 75 ppi. The reason this matters is that if you use a high resolution image and your printer is a low resolution printer, you're creating huge files that may choke the printer. Like the printer may not have enough processing power to deal with the image resolution that you use. That's not much of a problem today as it was in the past, because now processing power is kind of commonplace in printers.
So looking at this little guy here, we see our effective PPI is at 204. What I would do in a quick fix, obviously if we can create it at a better size to begin with or get a better source data, that's great. But we're not that far off. We're only 50% under. So I would edit this guy, go over to Photoshop, change the image size. And here I would go to percent. We know we're at 200. We want to be at 300. So we have to increase by 150%. Just like that. That's fine. Okay, so now if we save that and hop back to InDesign, you can see our effective PPI for that image has jumped to 306. We've gained some interpolation and some enlargement from Photoshop's work. Once we're getting over that much enlargement, we're going to have diminishing returns, but it's a good thing to do to just check your files and your images in your spread to make sure everything's looking good for that. In terms of then going to print, we can, if we just go to high quality prints here, it's going to prompt us for a, I usually bump this up to about 7 because that works for the printers we have here. This isn't something that you have to email out to thousands of people and you don't know if some of them are still on Windows XP, that kind of thing. We're pretty sure that people are up to date here, and the computers you're going to use in your workflow, you could bump it even higher. If you're doing a book, you can do to fit the page, and you can actually set how the pages look in InDesign or in Acrobat when you open it. So if you have like a title and then facing pages, instead of Acrobat just being individual pages, if you want people to see the spreads but be able to print individual pages, you can set that here. And then we go over to marks and bleeds, right? So we're going to turn on use document bleed settings because we've set those for ourselves. You can see it inherits those from the document settings. And then we're just going to turn on crop marks. You could turn all of these on if you want to feel like a pro, but this is the only really relevant one to us. The crop marks like that, and it's got those all set up for us. We say, okay, you can see under compression here, it's automatically for anything, as Branko was saying, that's larger than we need, it's automatically going to downscale that to 300 dots per inch in this iteration. So you can increase or decrease that if you need better file size.
Just one more thing, like if you're simply creating PDFs that people are going to watch on the screens or review on the screens, you can really bump this down.
Yeah,
PPI to 150 or even 75.
I'll show that, sure. So here, we're going for print, so we have our crop marks. We export. It's going to take a sec to think of those guys. And then there we go. So we end up with this, right? So we can see the outside of the page is broader. We have our trim marks, and then our actual print area goes past the trim marks right to the corner. Has anyone taught you guys how to use crop marks to cut boards? How to use them properly? Here's the trick. I didn't learn this till recently, and it totally blew my mind. So we'll see if it has a similar effect on you. So here's your page, and you can practice this at home with just a knife. Okay, so that's our page. Page has crop marks, which are offset from each other, so they're never in the frame. But of course, if you're not paying attention, the first thing you do is you cut them off, right? You're like, okay, you line up your ruler, and then you like cut like this, and now these crop marks are gone, right? Like, it's game over. So the way it's designed to work, and I wish someone would have told this to me 10 years ago, is that you put your knife down here,
Yes.
you move it to here, and you let go. You put your knife down here, you pull it to here, and you let go. Knife down here, pull it to here. This is all still one sheet of paper. Knife down here, and then right at that moment, the inside comes loose and free. Life is good. It's remarkable how well it works.
It took you 10 years to figure it out?
I wasn't trying to figure it out. No one told me. Who was responsible for my education anyways? Oh.
That's a good one. Not me.
Grayscale is not the only shade in the classroom today. Okay, so all right, where were we? That's how you cut things, okay? The other thing and this is a trick for mounting things, like to foam core, cardboard, or whatever else. You mount first and then cut, right? But let's see. What helps when you're putting you spray the back of this all the way, line it up as best you can, and then your roller. So you guys all have brayers, right? You have like nice rubber rollers. Okay, you should grab one to share because it makes life way better, and you don't have to touch your stuff and get fingerprints all over it, and it evenly presses things out. So usually what we do is once it's in place, we put the roller down here, and we roll out to that corner from the middle, roll out to that corner from the middle, okay? Then we roll down the middle like that, and then we do like that on each side, strokes rolling from that middle glued section. And then you avoid air bubbles, right? You're always working towards the edges, but you're able to set that top edge first. So you kind of make a T, out, out, down, and then you make the ribs, okay? So next time you're doing that. So that takes you through the full print production, cutting, gluing, and checking for print outputs. If you want to just share for a digital submission, for example, for not a print scenario, we say File. I wouldn't do these PDF presets. I would just say Export, and then choose PDF Interactive, and you'll see.
And the difference in file size is humongous.
Yeah. So this allows us to set all of these parameters for how it looks. You can see it's dropping it's doing lossy JPEG for all images at medium quality and dropping everything down to 72 dpi. This is assuming that most people will look at it on a low res screen.
So when you submit to us to actually look at this, don't submit a huge file because we're going to look at it on the screen. We're not going to print it. But the one that you're going to send to the plotter here, that one should have proper resolution.
So our little interactive PDF is 325 kilobytes. Like it's almost like you could actually fit it on a floppy. You could fit a couple on a floppy disk. And this one, it's not going to be much bigger, but 7.4 megabytes. So it compressed it by like an order of 25, like a 25th of the size, right? And on the screen, we can't really tell the difference, right? So it doesn't really matter. So two different workflows for if you're doing a digital submission. We have received digital submission files in excess of 3 gigabytes before. I don't know how it happens. I think if you're laying things out in Illustrator, Illustrator will punish you for doing that. But that's essentially it. Okay, I'm going to stop the tutorial now because I think I've covered Are there any? Do you guys have any questions about any of this? Anything you'd like me to show again, or a technique that you'd like clarified?
Yeah, how do you place the image into that raster of the rectangle?
Sure, I'll do that again. So there's a tool. If you hit the B key, it's called the content collector tool. And if you hit B, it switches between put down and pick up. Okay, so you can grab content and place it in other spots. So that's the tool I was using to collect content. But before I did that, so if I was to take this and I was to take him and place him in one of these containers, obviously it becomes very small. But if you wanted to do it in a cluster of containers, the first step is to make the containers a compound path. So it understands multiple lines as describing a single shape. So you guys know, like in typography, the letter A has to be a compound path because it's got a hole in it. Does that make sense? So like the letter L, you can describe with a single outline. The letter A, you cannot describe with a single outline. You need a second outline. So it always recognizes that there's a relationship between these two shapes, that this one subtracted from this one to make one entity, right? So that's anytime you have more than one curve that describes something dependently, and it reads it as a single object, that's a compound shape. In this case, we can take a cluster of any number of these boxes. We go Object, Paths, Make a Compound Path, and you can see that it adjusts the frame guides, that X that's inside them. So now if we want to drop our fella in here and then size him to the containers that he's going to fill the multiple grid boxes. So that makes sense? Good.
How did you learn all of this, man? Nobody taught you this in class.
School of Hard Knocks. No, I mean on the streets. This is just street learning. So.
The reason I